Okay, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining the webinar. Just wanted to start off just on a logistical note that there is simultaneous interpretation for this webinar, which will predominantly be in English and the translation into Spanish. To enable that, there should be an interpretation button on the bottom of your screen, bottom right, and you click the relevant channel to hear either English or Spanish translation. There'll be one presentation that is delivered in Spanish and then interpreted into English. There is also an option in the interpretation feature you will see to mute the original sound if you prefer not to hear the original speaker. And one other logistical note is that to ask questions, please do use the chat. And during the 2 question slots for this webinar, you can put in your questions there and we'll pick those up. So now I'm going to hand over to Crick Portman, who is the chair of Cost International, who will open the webinar.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Glad you could all make it and share us this morning, at least in Washington, D.C. This is morning time. We in Cost are very excited about presenting this Infrastructure Transparency Index today. To us, it's the logical next step in the development of Cost, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, which we feel has become a successful global program to reduce mismanagement, inefficiency, and corruption, and thus improve the performance of public infrastructure investment. The index is an evaluation instrument that measures the levels of infrastructure transparency and the quality of the associated processes that improve participation of stakeholders and strengthen public accountability. Experience has taught us that indices are an important tool to measure performance and also to incentivize policy action. We all know that what gets measured gets attention and focus, and normally has a greater chance of getting done. It is fitting, I think, that this webinar takes place on December 9, International Anti-Corruption Day. We all know that the public infrastructure sector is one of the sectors most prone to corruption. And given the sector's economic and budgetary importance, addressing its governance is potentially one of the most important actions we can take to tackle corruption worldwide. The index has gone through a rigorous review process, tested in 2 cost countries, Honduras and Guatemala, and peer-reviewed by international experts. The results have been very encouraging. 2 additional cost countries, Afghanistan and Ukraine, have now committed to introducing the index, and a number of additional countries are likely to follow suit. And we're hopeful that countries and organizations beyond the Cost family will start experimenting with the index as well. We have asked a number of speakers to be on our panel today, and they all, I feel, are very qualified to speak to the issues surrounding the index. First is David Zamora, the lead author of the manual, who will present an overview of the index methodology, as well as the results from testing the index. He will be followed by Alvaro Zepeda from the Guatemalan Chamber of Construction, who will share some lessons from the Guatemala experience. After these 2 presentations, there will be a short time for a brief question and answer. Next, after that, will be Jim Anderson from the World Bank, who will set out what he believes to be the value and the potential of the index and lessons from similar tools. He will be followed by Elena Mondo of the International Budget Partnership, who will share lessons from the International Budget Survey. And last but not least, you will hear short video messages from Natalie Forsuk, the Ukraine Deputy Minister of Infrastructure, and Karima Hamid Faryabi, the Afghanistan Minister of Economy, who will state their commitment to introducing the index in their respective countries. If all goes well, we will have another 15 minutes of questions and answer before we close the session. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to David for his presentation. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Crick. I'm very happy and honored to be here with you after a journey of preparation and working in the construction of the index, be capable of presenting it to all of you. So be of having that opportunity. Allow me please to share my presentation. You please confirm that you can see it.
It looks like it's just loading up.
Can you?
Yes.
Can you see the slides? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, great. So yes, I'm having the opportunity to introduce the index to you. So Infrastructure Transparency Index is a tool for strengthening transparency.
Sorry, David, to cut you off. I think the I don't know if it's just mine, but I think the internet connection is slightly weak. Are others having the same issue?
Yes, more or less. I think we might survive, but it shouldn't get worse.
Okay, David, if you perhaps turn off your video, that might help.
Just a second. Enough the video.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Great. Okay. So, all right, I'll continue. What I'll be doing in these 10 minutes I have available is introducing the Infrastructure Transparency Index with its objectives, benefits, and purpose. Talk to you about what are the evaluation components, what does the index evaluate, how does the index collect data, and I will tell you what a typical process looks like, and share thoughts we obtained during test implementation we had in Guatemala in 2019, and briefly tell you about the next steps of the ET on this 2021. This simple concept that defines what the ET is. It is an instrument that measures the levels of infrastructure transparency and the quality of the associated processes at a national or subnational level. Can be implemented from a country perspective or from a local perspective. The E aims this, the levels of transparency, accountability, the public infrastructure sector over time. It means that the ET, the methodology of the ET states that the implement should be implemented periodically so that it provides value on and information on how performance is being achieved. However, for the time, the ET also assesses the state of transparency and key to improve transparency among procurement entities focuses a lot on entities, on the information and the capacities that they have in order to disclose that information. The ET aims to track and encourage progress and facilitate peer learning while holding to help to human entities account. This means that it also promote procurement entities to collaborate between each other and share learned lesson experiences, improve, and also raise awareness of transparency at the national international level, while building on existing standards such as the IDS and the OC for IDS. What ET does is conduct an evaluation that provides a, let's say, a score that tells what status of the national environment, and also provides a score to procurement entities with details of how that score is in terms of the variables that compose those scores, all those variables with their corresponding scores. At the end, this information is there to help and weaknesses in public structure. That information aims to help the development among stakeholders to raise transparency standards within the sector. And that information also is their capacities and transparency and connectivity. That information can help from the take of to improve how to generate the capacity to improve the transparency.
David,
but it also valuable
David, sorry.
information.
Sorry to cut you off, David. I think that the connection is quite bad for all the panelists, and we're struggling to hear at the moment. John is able to actually take over the presentation just so everyone can hear it. So if okay by you, we'll pass to John for the rest of the delivery.
Sure, no problem.
Sorry about that. It's just a technical.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It should not be happening, but I guess these things occur.
Yeah.
Yeah, that might be better. So, John.
Okay. Sorry, I just need to share my screen.
I think I made a change here that might help now.
Yeah, that's much better, David. That's much better.
Yeah, I noticed that I was connected to a different network, but I was able to change. Maybe that should improve the quality.
Okay,
Can
let's
you hear me better
continue.
now?
Let's
Go ahead,
continue, David, and see whether it works otherwise. But this looks better. So go ahead.
Okay, that's great. So there, you can see my presentation again?
Yes, we can. So go ahead.
Okay, that's great. So the index also has some characteristic principles that were used to design the instrument that represent the value that the index provides, and also characterize some of the rules that have to be applied while conducting an index evaluation. So those principles are relevance, comprehensiveness, simplicity and trustworthiness, replicability and objectivity. Also, the index provides an impartial evaluation. It has to be periodic, as I mentioned. It provides accurate information. It is very specific. It also is evolving in terms of the amount of procurement entities that should be evaluated over the time. It's informative, providing information from a from the procurement entity point of view, but also from a national point of view. And it's very constructive in terms of how to have valuable information to improve and to support or provide collaboration among procurement entities. When it comes to the infrastructure index structure, the index is made by a hierarchy of 4 levels. On the top of those levels, we have the dimensions which are four. I'll talk about them in a minute. Those dimensions are made by a group of variables, and those variables are made by a group of subvariables, and those subvariables are made by a group of indicators. And this is how the four-level hierarchy looks. When it comes to the ET dimensions, as I mentioned, the instrument has four main dimensions. The first dimension, the enabling environment, is a dimension that looks at the national context. It looks at the regulations and looks at the national digital information tools to provide information for citizens. And then the other three dimensions look at the procurement entities. The second one, capacities and processes, looks precisely at those capacities and processes that are part of procurement entities and see how they perform. Look also at the way that procurement entities engage with citizen participation on infrastructure projects. And that's the third dimension. And the fourth dimension looks at the quantity and quality of information that's being disclosed by procurement entities on infrastructure projects. These dimensions are aligned with empirical studies that say that the outcomes are not only achieved by the existence of laws, but also on the existence of laws and capacities. And what we do here on the ET is having the opportunity to deeply evaluate that environment and those capacities, and also the outcomes that are being provided in terms of the quality of information that's being disclosed. When it comes to the data collection, the dimensions have different ways of capturing the data. The dimension of enabling environment, which I mentioned, looks at the national or subnational conditions. It's evaluated through desktop research. The evaluation team conducts a desktop research in terms of what information is available in terms of the regulatory framework and the digital information tools. And the information disclosure, the fourth dimension, is also evaluated through desktop research. That means that the evaluation team looks at the information that is published by the procurement entities on the different infrastructure projects. The other two dimensions, capacities and processes and citizen participation, are evaluated through a survey that can be applied through a self-assessment or an interview, depending on what seems to be better on the local or the national context. When it comes also to the when it comes to the design of this type of exercises, there has to be a close attention that has to be being put to objectivity. And the infrastructure index is not an exception. It has several methods to provide objectivity on the way the evaluations are conducted. And the scoring scales is one example of those objectivity measures. All the indicators that are part of the index, and here you can see an example of the very first one indicator that's part of the dimension 1. You can see what's the indicator, the description, and you can see the indicator has a scoring scale. All the indicators, as I mentioned, have a scoring scale. The objective of that scoring scale is to try to reduce the subjectivity of the evaluation team while assigning a score to the information that they are being able to see while they're conducting the evaluation. Besides these scoring scales, there are other methods that the index uses to try to maintain objectivity and quality during the process and on the information that provides. When it comes to the implementation process, a typical index implementation would have these four main stages, which are preparation, evaluation, processing, and reporting. The preparation stage is where the evaluation team is integrated. The evaluation team is trained. The procurement entities to be evaluated are selected. The infrastructure projects are also selected. the logistics are arranged, and also, and that's pretty much what it is. Then the evaluation stage is where actually the data is captured through the methods I mentioned throughout the different dimensions. And then once that data is collected, it can be processed. Then that's the third stage. And after that is when the reporting comes, where the reports are prepared and the information is disclosed, and the results are disclosed and made available through to all stakeholders to provide them with the valuable information the ET provides. This is a summary of the results that can be seen through an index implementation. What we have here is a summary of the Guatemala IT results. You can see here the total procurement entities that were evaluated in Guatemala when we conducted this test in 2019. 15 different procurement entities were evaluated, and you can see the global score they achieved and how that provides to develop a ranking among those procurement entities. And also you can see the scores that those entities received on the other dimensions that were evaluated. With those results, I mean, this is a way, one way to present results. We also included a deeper look at the different procurement entities, and we created this type of scoring cards that provide a summary or a deeper look at the performance of the different procurement entities. And here you can see the rank that a specific entity achieved, and you can see the scores that entity received in terms of I mean, a deeper look of the ET components. And besides, and this is part of the general report that it was prepared, and the index actually in its methodology, it recommends to prepare these type of reports once the results are achieved. And besides that, the methodology of the index also requests to disclose a database of results that includes all the details, I mean, all the variables and all the procurement entities and the scores that they received in each one of those specific variables. I believe there is where the value of the information is, where the different stakeholders can use that information to understand where are their weaknesses and strengths. So let's remember what the ET does or intends to do is to conduct an evaluation of the information that's been disclosed on infrastructure. It evaluates the capacities that the procurement entities have to disclose that information, evaluates the way they engage with citizens on infrastructure projects, and also evaluates the national conditions that allow infrastructure transparency. That evaluation provides specific scores, and scores that are there to help raise awareness about the strengths and weaknesses in public infrastructure, scores that help to develop a collaborative agenda among different stakeholders to raise transparency and accountability, and scores that are there to help to guide public leaders to build capacities to strengthen transparency and accountability. And all these over time, as I mentioned, that is part of the concept of the index. And finally, this is the next steps that we're seeing ahead in terms of the ET implementation. We'll be starting in a few weeks to implement the ET in these 4 countries: Afghanistan, Costa Rica, Thailand, and Ukraine. And tentatively in 2021, we will probably, so we will also see an African country. We will be having some collaboration with other interested partners. We will document the lessons to fine-tune the manual. This means that each time the ET is implemented in a country, we will be looking at the details of that experience to see if there's still are some things to improve. And we will use all those lessons to consider an international version of the index that will allow cross-country comparison. And that's pretty much what I had prepared. Thank you, and excuse me for that issue with the internet a few minutes ago.
Thank you, David. very useful. Good to set the stage for the discussion and any further comments. Let's turn to Alvaro Zepeda from the Guatemala Chamber of Construction and to give us brief comments about the Guatemala experience. So Alvaro, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias a todos. Buen día, buena noche, buenas tardes. Yo haré mi presentación en español para poderme expresar un poquito mejor y contar todas esas experiencias que hemos tenido. Realmente lo primero fue que a nosotros recibimos un índice que había empezado a hacer Honduras. Y cuando lo tratamos de aplicar a Guatemala, yo creo que estaba hecho muy a lo hondureño. Esto hizo que decidiéramos también nosotros quererlo cambiar y hacerlo más internacional. Entonces, cuando estuvimos consultando cómo hacerlo, lo que hicimos fue se contrató a David, que es alguien que tiene experiencia en hacer estos índices, y así fue como empezamos a tratar de hacerlo. El segundo paso creo que fue importante, fue haber trabajado esos índices y haber tenido una reunión con David en Guatemala, con diferentes instituciones y diferentes gentes de diferentes países, y poder en ese momento definir los parámetros como muy bien los pudo captar y después sacar el índice. Ya después, cuando teníamos el índice y había que aplicarlo, creo que el primer reto, como decía David, es la preparación. En esa preparación teníamos que definir qué instituciones y qué proyectos íbamos a elegir. Y eso es algo que creo que es muy importante, que uno defina, tenga los parámetros claros desde el principio. Nosotros en ese sentido tuvimos que primero, como era primera vez, era primero ver que fueran proyectos que estuvieran finalizados. Segundo, que fueran de diferentes tipos de entidades. Había entidades como las municipalidades, habían otras entidades que era gobierno central, el Ministerio de Infraestructura, o sea, tenía que ver de diferentes tipos de entidades. Después de eso, teníamos que ver que fueran proyectos con diferentes montos. Una cantidad, el valor del proyecto, hay unos altos y hay otros que no son tan altos, pero teníamos que tener un poquito de todos los datos. Y por último, a veces hay proyectos que son de gran impacto, entonces creíamos necesario tener claros que esos eran proyectos importantes. Con eso, entonces, realmente lo que hicimos nosotros, primero elegimos las instituciones, elegimos los proyectos de esas instituciones y entonces salieron las 15 instituciones a las cuales pues ahí estaba en el listado que entregó David y vimos los resultados. De ahí el siguiente paso, que fue donde nos costó también un poco, fue cómo hacer la evaluación. Entonces, una parte era el escritorio, como muy bien decía David, pero otra parte es una evaluación. Entonces, hay que capacitar a esas personas para ir a evaluar y muchas veces creo que es algo que tal vez se puede hacer y mejorar, es cómo quitarle lo sentimental, el sentimiento que siempre existe de parte de alguien que va a hacer una encuesta, ¿ya? Para que entonces sea lo más claro y lo más, ¿cómo se llama? Realmente que no tenga que ver lo sentimental de la persona que hace la evaluación. Por último, pues también teníamos que ver la gente, las personas que lo iba a hacer, no solo capacitarlos, sino que tener contratarlos y ver cómo hacíamos esa evaluación. Creo que cuando lo hicimos nosotros, después de haberlo hecho y haberlo analizado, vimos que había varias ventajas de hacer este índice. Primero, es crear una competencia entre las instituciones. Cuando se publica un índice y calificas a las instituciones, creo que se está formando una competencia entre ellas. Es algo que es bueno porque entonces puede venir uno y mejorar la divulgación. Entre las prácticas que se podría hacer más adelante es dar algún reconocimiento a las empresas, perdón, a las instituciones que tienen mejor calificación. Entonces, eso va a ayudar, primero, a que haya más divulgación y segundo, a que esa divulgación nos lleve a que haya más transparencia. Eso nos ayuda también a que exista más competitividad entre toda, digamos, para más competencia, una mejor información de qué es lo que se está haciendo, y hace también que exista mayor participación de empresas. Cuando hay mucha corrupción y cuando los proyectos no son claros, algo que existe es que muchas de los trabajos que se hacen participan muy pocas personas. ¿Por qué? Porque no hay interés en eso, porque saben que hay algún tipo de corrupción, lo cual pues no ayuda, ¿ya? Por último, creo que sí hay que ver de qué forma exista voluntad política, ¿ya? Y que exista, que es el otro factor que nosotros, que también exista auditoría social con todo lo que se publica. Creo que se puede mejorar la información, la calidad de la información, pero lo que es importante es que de parte del sector gobierno exista esa disponibilidad, esa voluntad para poder participar. Porque si ellos lo bloquean, que ya incluso una de las experiencias que nos pasó aquí en Guatemala, porque a nadie, y sobre todo a los gobiernos, no les gusta que lo estén evaluando, pero eso es algo de lo que creo que hay que buscar, esa voluntad política. Y por último, también algo que nos ha hecho falta aquí en Guatemala es la auditoría social, que hasta ahora la estamos haciendo, o hasta ahora la estamos, digamos, iniciativas como COST, lo que hacen es cabalmente promover esa auditoría, que creo que es la que nos va a ayudar a hacer mejores obras y cumplir los tiempos y cumplir los costos de las que realmente tenemos las obras, cuando ven que realmente lo que hay es una auditoría sobre los trabajos que están haciendo. Con eso terminaría y quedo listo para las preguntas. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I think it fills in some of the questions that people may have, and some of the questions surrounding the viability of implementing this and what kind of environment one needs for success. Before going on, I just briefly like to, I've seen that Bill Patterson has joined us from New Zealand. I just want to flag this because Bill has been very much involved in the initial setting up of cost, and also very much involved in the design of the index. So he should be proud today of seeing the results of that come to fruition. So Bill, welcome. We have now a little time for questions and answer. I see that there are 2 or 3 questions that have come in. I'm not sure, John, let me pass them on to you, and maybe you can determine who's best to answer them. I see one question from Claire about the choice of the countries. Why did we choose these countries and not others? And then Olive, hello, Olive. Great that you can join us here. She gets 2 very pertinent questions. One about sort of incentivizing the private sector to improve its business practices. And then the question, indeed, that was also on my mind: how many times does one conduct an index? How many times a year? What is the frequency? So, John, these are the questions I have. I don't know whether other questions will come in, but maybe you can start with those.
Okay, yeah. So I'll start by answering Claire's question, and maybe 1 or 2 points around Olive's response. Then David, you could add to the responses afterwards. So the why Honduras and Guatemala? We asked at the time we started with the idea, and had the resources to really develop it. Honduras had been incredibly successful, very innovative. They developed their open data platform. They won an OGP award for their citizen engagement program, and really driving a lot of innovation. So we really thought, why not have take this idea and really ask them to take it forward and develop some kind of methodology and indices. And then Guatemala had also got a good e-procurement platform. They had data, so having the access to data was really important to be able to do this. And given our neighboring countries, there was some similarities that we could share ideas and lessons. So really that was the choice, why we started there within the kind of cost program. And then going forward, we've been, again, having access to data makes a difference. And in Ukraine and Afghanistan, who you hear from shortly, again, have that good data systems and platforms now, which we can start to really help develop the kind of learn from, again, in terms of developing the index in other contexts. But then really it's now public document. We want other countries to use it and adopt it and have a real demand-led approach to it. Then on Olive's questions, no, this doesn't replace assurance or disclosure. It's a new tool to augment those as well. So it's something very much different to augment those. And then David, do you want to talk about how and when you might want to use the tool?
Yes, sure. So what we are recommending on the methodology is to conduct annual evaluations. I think that can be a starting point of how frequent the index should be implemented. A country that conducts an evaluation, let's say once it conducts its first evaluation, it's in a better position to define if it's feasible for them to still be conducting these evaluations annually, or perhaps if they decide maybe that's better to do it, let's say after 2 years, let's say once each 2 years. There are different so each country will have different situations, context, and that will allow them to decide which situation is better. But the recommendation that we're providing in terms of seeing this application, in terms of seeing other indexes, is to have evaluations one evaluation each year, and within each evaluation to increase the amount of procurement entities that are evaluated in each time. And a very important insight in terms of the implementation, because as the number of procurement entities increase, also will increase the value of the results that the index provides, and in terms of more transparency, more participation, and so on.
Thank you. I think there's maybe I will briefly go back to Alvaro with two questions. They are really related. One is the one that Olive asked about: how do you get the private sector to improve its business practices? And then there was another question, I didn't know where it came from, but a good question about what was the reaction from the procuring entities and the officials about being scrutinized, and what was the level of cooperation in putting this index, or the building blocks of this index together. So maybe Alvaro, you can give a very quick answer to that from your experience.
Sí, con mucho gusto. Las entidades realmente no les gusta que se les evalúe, pero nosotros tenemos aquí en Guatemala que hay una ley que obliga acceso a la información, y aparte de eso tenemos todos los estándares costs metidos como obligatorios en una ley. El hecho que exista esa ley en Guatemala nos ayuda a poder exigir esa información, porque está en ley. Entonces ellos tienen obligación de publicarla. Originalmente, cuando no estaba en ley, sí teníamos que tener muy buena alianza, y ahí es donde les digo la voluntad política de los gobernantes, porque sin el apoyo de los gobernantes no se logra mucho. Ya con esta ley, pues sí hemos logrado obtener esa información, como incluso un poco a la fuerza en ciertos momentos. Hay instituciones que trabajan muy bien y no hay problema, hay otras instituciones que sí es difícil. Cuando le publicamos la información después, esa es una arma que tenemos, que a los que no quieren colaborar les decimos, bueno, si ustedes no quieren colaborar, de todas maneras se va a indicar que a ustedes se les evaluó y que a ustedes se estuvo en contacto con ustedes y que ustedes no quisieron colaborar. Entonces sepan que el informe que va a haber de ustedes como entidades, falta de colaboración, y eso tampoco se ve bien. Entonces yo creo que esas son las razones y las formas en las que hemos logrado, así como que un poco a la fuerza y obligado, el obtener la cooperación de ellos. Pero sí, hay entidades en las que es muy difícil, y hay otras entidades que sí son muy abiertas y depende mucho de voluntad política y las personas que estén trabajando ahí. Gracias.
Craig, if I may just add 10 seconds to that response. While we were conducting the test in Guatemala and Honduras, we learned a lot in the process of capturing the data from procurement entities. So what I wanted to say is that we have included in the index manual a protocol with specific recommendations on how to address the relation with the procurement entities. So we've used those experiences to guide the evaluation team on how to collaborate and how to ask the information to the procurement entities. And I think that's very valuable, and it's a section that is already included in the manual.
Thank you, David. We will now, there will be another, hopefully another time for some questions and answers later on, but we'll continue the presentations. Next we'll go to Jim Anderson of the World Bank. Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Craig, and thank you for the presentations and the invitation to come today. So I thought what I do, I mean, first is highlight some of the things that I think are some really nice features of the way that you're approaching this, and this comes from having looked at a great many different types of exercises to assess, measure different aspects of governance. It's very nice that it's already piloted and tested. I like the emphasis on replicability and the sort of the principle that anyone would, using this framework, would reach the same conclusion. It's hard to do, but it doesn't impose a certain discipline on you in designing the process. The multi-stakeholder approach, of course, is very important to some extent. I'll say more about this in a minute, but the journey is the destination with this thing, not entirely. Of course, there are other destinations, but the journey of discussing and deliberating and going through it is very important, very granular. And the emphasis on doing it repeatedly over time is also extremely important. I like that it's something that's implemented at the entity level. As was mentioned in the previous, in the explanations, doing so also has the benefit of trying to foster a bit of competition. I've seen in other similar exercise where there's not about infrastructure transparency or procurement transparency, but access to information more generally. When an entity gets rated poorly, they want to know why, and sometimes it's fixable without too much difficulty. So what I was asked to talk about the value and potential of this, and I can only agree with the points that were made by David and Alvaro about the exercise. One, I think David put it in the framework, had an equation: laws plus capacities lead to outcomes. And we often sometimes jump straight to outcomes in our attempts to measure and assess, and we don't focus enough on trying to have any kind of an objective assessment of laws and capacities. And that's the way I think about it too. So I work particularly on corruption and anti-corruption, and there are indices out there of corruption. Sometimes we do surveys about experiences with corruption, but it's also really important to understand this other side of the equation, the laws and capacities, the policies. So the value is, I think there are multiple values. One is understanding what are the key features that work. For external audiences, there's the value that comes from tracking, being able to show progress, building that sense of competition or not wanting to be at the bottom of the scale by an entity. That's all very important. But there's also the internal audience, and that is the people that work to generate this. I like the expression that was used in the presentation, to build a collaborative agenda. And I think that's extremely important. So I also wanted to mention value that I see, or consistency with some of our thinking at the World Bank. We've launched something that we call the anti-corruption initiatives. And this was based on a kind of a rethinking about some of the some of the changes that have taken place in the world, and what we, the World Bank, could be doing more of, or doing differently, or scaling up, or totally new ground. And we came up with 5 of these initiatives, and the ITI cuts across at least 3 of these. So one is what we called high definition transparency. So that's this is building on the idea that there have been improvements in transparency in many areas, but there's often not as much uptake or use of transparency and access to information that we would like. And at the same time, there's still a lot more that can be done in many different areas to build even more transparency. We also want to refresh our sector-based approach, which I think is very, very important. So, it's very popular to sort of just talk about corruption as a very general phenomena, but a lot of times, if you want to unpack that relationship between outcomes and what generates those outcomes, you really need to look at the sector level. Also, we want to emphasize the value of global norms and standards. And I think something like the ITI is very important for helping generate that collaborative agenda, that shared understanding of what is important and what matters. So I think the consistency there is notable with our own thinking. A couple of lessons just before I stop, a couple of lessons from having observed other exercises to work on this side of the equation, where you're trying to objectively measure policies and institutions, capacities, et cetera. One is the need to maintain so I think something like this has value even as a one-off exercise, because, as I said, the discussion, the sense of competition, et cetera, can be an important influence, but it's even more valuable if it's done repeatedly. I know that's in the plans, and I hope that will happen, that it's done periodically over time. And the other lesson, as I mentioned earlier, it's important also to focus on the uptake, how information gets used. And I know that's in your plans also. So I applaud that. But thank you again for the invitation to come, and enjoyed the presentations. And I'll be watching what comes next with the ITI. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for taking the time to join us today and give us an insight. I'm glad that we seem to be ticking a few of the boxes of what the World Bank likes to see. So that's very encouraging. Next, we'll go to Elena Mondo from the International Budget Partnership. Please, the floor is yours. We have a little presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to echo what Jim was saying, it's interesting because you might have seen me nodding a lot of times, and it's just because Jim's remarks really reflect a lot of the thinking that IBP has been making around our own open budget survey. So it's nice to see that we think along the same lines. And first of all, before sharing a few of the lessons that we at the International Budget Partnership have learned through the years with the implementation of the open budget survey that we've done since 2006, I just want to again congratulate David and John and the team at COST for
we lost you.
producing or testing, decided to comment on the initial draft of the assessment, and I am really impressed at how the team managed to deal with the complexities of the assessment in a clear and understandable way. The visual that David showed us with the dimensions all the way through to the indicators really is an evidence of that. I really thought it was very important to convey the complexities of the assessment in a way that is understandable. Same for the sampling of entities and projects. I thought it was a daunting exercise to begin with, and I think you guys are dealing with this in a pretty impressive way. I like the practical approach with concrete guidelines, templates, very specific recommendations to the point of, for example, how to engage with procuring entities, including soft skills, which I think is very important in these circumstances. Also following what the Guatemalan colleague has just shared. Having really pushed for public participation in fiscal in open budgeting at the IBP, I also really appreciated you dedicating a specific section on public participation, because again, we also really think that this is an essential element to ensure accountability, and that can also help in improving services, right, and implementation of infrastructure projects. And then finally, I also welcome all your efforts to minimize subjectivity. I think this really speaks to what I'm going to say next, which is lessons that we've also learned at the IBP on implementing the Open Budget Survey, which is, for those who don't know about it, is
Seems to have lost you again.
145 scored questions assessment that measures how open. If I take my video off, can you hear me better like this?
Well, let's try it. Yes.
Okay, so quick overview of the Open Budget Survey, which is an assessment of how open national budgets are. It's a very long research process, which involves an 18-month research and dissemination cycle. It involves 120 countries and over 350 people overall. So it's fairly big undertaking. And the results of the latest survey were published in April this year. So, and that was the 7th edition. We have historical data available since 2006 for 40 countries, because we've increased the number of countries through the years. And we're about to embark into our new route of survey in the next coming weeks, including a COVID transparency specific module. I have lumped the lessons learned into 3 buckets. The first bucket that I would like to share is about building and strengthening the credibility of the assessment. And we've tried to do this in a number of ways. The first was by having an evidence-based assessment, and also using international standards. So building the indicators with the back of the international standards, just OECD standards or IMF fiscal transparency standards, into SAI transparency standards. Another point that I thought was useful to make is that simpler seemed to be better for the application of the methodology by researchers and reviewers. And so the understanding of the methodology is key to make sure that the survey is implemented well in an accurate way, and so which also influences the credibility, of course. And so that was something we worked on quite a bit, and that also helped a lot for the communication and dissemination purposes, because that it really made us communicate our findings in a more compelling way. Having strong, but also most importantly, unbiased in-country partners was particularly useful to support the credibility of the tool, as well as independent peer reviews, and including governments into the draft questionnaire discussions through the research process. And again, really, it's all about, at least for us, data accuracy. And so making sure that the data is as accurate, as consistent as possible has been key to support the credibility of the tool. The second bucket of lessons that we've learned, I would say, is about comparability across countries and time series. We really make a lot of efforts to make sure that there is a common understanding and implementation of the assessment across countries. And so that includes making sure that the researchers understand the methodology. So we have extensive conversations with researchers and reviewers, but also internal conversations, because of course we have a team of 10 people, and some level of subjectivity might still come through. And so it's very important to make sure that we discuss specific indicators, responses in particular countries, to make sure that we all have applied the methodology in the same way consistently. There are considerations about staff turnover, and so we also are very aware of that, because of course every time a new person comes in, there is a learning curve about the methodology, and making sure that again the application is consistent. And in terms of the time series, again, one of the values that at least our index has, and also this speaks to what Jim just said, is about the comparability across time. And so we've always had very long discussions and deliberations before deciding whether to change, remove, add indicators. I mean, when something isn't at a pilot stage is one thing, but then once the index was sort of settled, we really kind of reflected a long time before decided to make changes or not. And that was really to maintain comparability across time. And then the third bucket of lessons that I'd like to share with you is about feasibility, which is really about what we would like to do versus what we can do, in the sense that we really have to be realistic in for example, how many countries we could cover, how frequently we could do the assessment. And this really responds to a lot of, or a bit of pressure that we received from various stakeholders, including donors, on doing this assessment yearly instead of biannually, or including more and more countries. And again, this is something that just wasn't possible given the resources that we have available, given that we have a team that's limited, and we also want to avoid staff burnout, obviously, given the size of the project and the number of people involved, because you might imagine that pulling along like 350 people throughout a whole process really takes a lot of effort, and in light of everybody's priorities and deadlines. So if one person lags behind, there's a whole chain that kind of follows through. So that's a bit challenging. We also want to give time for governments to make changes, in the sense that the survey, as I'm sure, as the cost assessment, the ITI assessment, is really, again, not just about the assessment, but it's about making sure that improvements are made. And so we had to make sure that there was time for governments to see the results, but also make the changes that we wanted them to make. So having too frequent of assessment really makes it difficult for governments to make those changes. And needless to say, three things have helped us in reducing or in kind of making this more feasible, this undertaking more feasible. One was about using technology, which has been super helpful in streamlining processes and make sure that we could keep track of everybody and everything. Second has been strong support from other parts of the IBP. So cross-program efforts and support has been really important and invaluable. And the last point, which I'd like to make, is really about managing expectations and requests. And so I think through the years, we've learned to say no more often, in the sense that, again, there is really a trade-off between speed and coverage and accuracy of the assessment, which again speaks to the credibility and therefore the life and the sustainability of the assessment. So I'll stop here. And again, congratulations again to the team at COST for a very exciting assessment. I look forward to see the full rollout.
Thank you, Elena. Some very important pointers. I think that some of them have already been taken into account, and others I think we need to keep in mind as we move forward. I think we might be able to run a little longer than we originally thought. So what I will do is we'll first hear the two short video messages from Ukraine and Afghanistan, and then we'll go back to a couple of questions. I see that there is a number of questions that relate to the issue of the quality of the data and the independent quality control and what have you, and maybe others that will come in a minute. But let us just turn to the short video messages, and then we'll have a little bit of time still for some questions. So Charlotte, can we have the video messages?
Yeah, sure. Just handing over to Manuel, who's you should be able to see his screen now. And We'll be playing those shortly. Manu, I think we've lost the screen sharing.
Yes, I'm trying. Can you confirm if you can see it now?
It's just loading up.
Just a second. I don't know what is going on. Just a second. Okay. Second. Yes.
Infrastructure Transparency Index will create a healthy competition between procuring entities. This will build trust to the government from the side of civil society and business. There are a few challenges we are going to meet in introducing it: lack of capacity in some procuring entities and quality of data. But data are the oil of 21st century, and we believe this practice will be scaled up in many countries.
Thanks, Manu. Just for those, just to introduce, that was Natalie Forsyth, who is the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure in Ukraine, and now we'll go to the Afghanistan Minister of Economy, a video that Manuel will share again.
The Infrastructure Transparency Index will benefit us because it will highlight progress on strengthening transparency and accountability in infrastructure sector. It will also draw attention to those government entities where challenges are persistent and progress is slow. In addition, the index will create healthy competition amongst procuring entities and accelerate reform. This will send a positive signal to international financial institutions and potential investors. There will be some challenges during implementation of this index, including new and unfamiliar to the officials involved, and the challenges in accessing to the good quality data. Therefore, we will work together with private sector and civil society to explain the benefit and provide technical assistance and support for implementing this index. Afghanistan is committed in reforming public investment in infrastructure, and we believe the Infrastructure Transparency Index can make an important contribution to the process. We look forward to receiving the results from testing the Infrastructure Transparency Index and hope that it will eventually be widely rolled out in Afghanistan and internationally. At the end, I would like to thank COST International for supporting countries like Afghanistan in fighting corruption on public budget.
Very good. Those were two statements about plans to introduce the ITI in specific country contexts. And we, as I said in my introduction, we hope there will be more after that. We have some time, and the best I can do possibly is to put John in charge of distributing the questions. What I have so far is a number of people, Yahara Velasquez and Edwin Lau and others, about the quality of the data and how to take that into account. There's questions about subjectivity. Is there independent quality control applied? Somebody is asking whether there's peer review. There's a whole host of questions surrounding that question of the issue of the quality of the data. Then there is the question from Bright So about the comparability across countries, a question I'm sure that many of us have been thinking about as we roll out the index, and maybe we can hear a little bit more about what the plans are here. Then there's a question about whether ITI should only be applied to low and middle income countries, or whether potentially other countries will form part of this index, or at least the process of trying to develop the index. And last but not least, Olive is raising an important question about the cost of conducting an ITI. I mean, is this a very expensive exercise? It goes also somewhat to the question of how many times the index should actually be developed. So there's a whole set of questions surrounding that. So John, maybe I can ask you to apportion the questions to those that you think are best set to answer them.
Thank you. Thank you, Crick. So first of all, David, would you be able to answer the question from Edwin Lau? Thank you, Edwin, for joining us today, around the use of peer review mechanisms to verify the responses from procuring entities and the quality of the data.
Okay, great. So there are three main ways or methods on which the manual, the manual proposes, on which we try to seek for objectivity and quality of the data. So the first one is the example of the scoring scales I mentioned, which somehow help to reduce the subjectivity of the evaluation team while they are capturing the data, because they have the different scenarios explained in those scales. Say, once the indicator asks for one specific piece of information, what the scale does is specifically address what could be the possible scenarios on which that information can be available, and based on those scientific amount of points that can be assigned. Okay, so the evaluators, they're not like fully free to assign whatever score they want. They're very limited in terms of how those scores are assigned. That's one thing. Another thing is the two dimensions, the first and fourth dimension, the enabling environment and the disclosure capacities. Those dimensions I mentioned are evaluated through desktop research. An important thing about that is that each one of the indicators that are part of these dimensions are evaluated by two different evaluators that do not share information between them. That means that those are independent views of the information that that's being evaluated, and they provide independent results. What the manual states is that you look at those at the results that those different evaluators assigned, and if they are the same, then you can trust that score that they have assigned. But if they are different, then a third evaluator comes in the process and resolves that difference, selecting one of the first two evaluation scores, and that pretty much allows a lot of trust on the score that it's assigned on that specific indicator. And the third one is in terms of how to maintain quality on the responses that are provided from the procurement entities. There are other two dimensions, remember, capacities and processes on procurement entities, as well as citizen participation. Those dimensions have a lot of indicators, and those indicators are evaluated based on the information that is provided on a survey that is completed by the procurement entity. That survey can be completed on the interview or can be completed on online. But each time, let's say each time there is a response coming from the procurement entity to one specific indicator, they will also have a scoring scale. But what the evaluation team does is looks at some qualitative information that has to be provided by the procurement entity. Let's say they provide a score, but with that score, there is also some extra qualitative information that the evaluation team takes and looks at carefully. And if that qualitative evaluation information is aligned with the score the procurement entity have provided, then they approve, let's say, the score that was assigned. If they consider that the qualitative information is not consistent with the score that the procurement entity is providing, then they will have to go back to the procurement entity and try to address the issue with them, whether more information is needed or the score has to be reassigned. And that would help to, let's say, look at all procurement entities under the same view and evaluate them in the same way. And besides that, well, that's what we're calling on the manual a triangulation method when it comes for the quality control. And there is also an endorsement that the procurement entities are providing on the survey. I mean, in terms of them signing that the information they're providing is information that that is true, that you can trust, and etc. But more importantly is how the evaluation team quality of information that's provided, and the manual states that this is the process how it has to be done.
Thank you, David. Keith Carter also has asked a question around with coping with potential subjectivity of the scoring. But I think hopefully that's been dealt with the way David has asked that question. I'll there's a couple of questions about how the application of the index, the idea is, yes, it could be used outside. It's a freely available tool and it can be used by any organization outside of COST, by anyone outside of the COST membership. We are potentially talking to an organization in Malaysia about them independently using the manual in that country. And we're very much like other organizations outside of COST to do something similar. And we particularly would like to work with a partner in a high-income country to see how it might work in that context. We think it could be applicable, but we would like to do some work in those contexts and see what the results and lessons would be from that approach as well, and to try and feed those kind of results into the process.
How does that relate, John, to this question about comparability across countries?
And then yes, comparability across countries. So I've sent a link to the blog that kind of describes how the index has been developed and why we've taken the approach we have. At the moment, it is very much focused at a national, subnational level, comparing procuring entities in trying to work to have that local buy-in and have a race to the top of the index between those kind of almost competing procuring entities. It was when the idea was conceived, there was a lot of discussion about cross-country comparators. There was a lot of concern about, well, how do you compare the UK with 40,000 plus procuring entities with Tanzania that had 500 procuring entities? How do we get the right sample? How do we get the right basis to make that kind of assessment? We've had this kind of where we've landed is that in due course, we would like to get to the point of having the option for an international comparator. I think there's two things that need to happen. One, the tool's being developed in a very cost way, in that we want to get that local ownership and potentially have some scope for local adaptability. But obviously, if you have an international comparators, it has to be virtually the same methodology and indices. So that would need to be rationalized and possibly slightly simplified. And secondly, it may be that you have to do it on a sector-by-sector basis. So you're comparing roads in Malawi with roads in Tanzania and Kenya, etc., or the energy sector. So you need the sectors are so different, you might have to do it by sector, but you may need to do a sector-by-sector for comparison in a regional or international. So they're the kind of things we're thinking about. And yes, it is something down the road we would like to get achieved.
Okay, I think we have exhausted the questions that we got. I mean, and after all, we're at the assigned time, and I know all of us, particularly for those of us whose day has only just started, we may have to turn to other things. I hope that this is not the end of the discussion that we're going to have. I mean, we have a large number of people who've been following this very closely, and I hope that that debate can continue as we move out. There are a lot of questions about the future. There are a lot of questions about learning as we're doing. There are a lot of good suggestions that have been made about how to improve and what to look for and what are the pitfalls that we shouldn't fall into as we move along. But I come away from this discussion as excited as I was when I started the meeting. I think that the development of this index seems to be responding to a need that is being seen by many, a need not only to look at what is happening, but also in terms of what incentives can we create for better performance as we move along. So I think this is a first but very important step that we've taken. There are a lot of people that are supporting us in this exercise, and I'm sure that if we have another meeting like this in another year or two, that hopefully we can even look back on an even better product in a larger number of countries that are feeling the need to implement this. First and foremost, this is a tool for countries and regions themselves to measure themselves over time. And if eventually we can move to a inter-country comparison, then so much the better. But there are many, as John just said, there are many other pitfalls associated with this, and all of us that have been involved in indices and publishing indices and then dealing with the repercussions, particularly if the index is being considered important by the countries that bring them out, you better make sure that you have it right. So it's a process that I think still needs to go through a lot further work, but for the time being, we have a very robust index and we can work with that. So with those words, I'd like to thank you all for spending your morning, at least as far as this side of the world is concerned, with us. I'd like to thank in particular our speakers. I mean, David, obviously, in laying out in a very concise manner how this index is going to work and how it was put together. And Alvaro, your information, your feedback was critically important to put a degree of realism into how this is perceived, and but also very encouraging to see that somebody from the private sector feels that this is a very useful tool and it should be developed further. That's been very helpful. And Jim, thank you for your comments. As I said before, I heard that there are a number of likes there as far as the bank is concerned. And as you know, we are and have been in very close contact with the bank in developing cost itself and the future of cost. So having you comment and get your views has been very helpful. Elena, you've obviously walked, or the IBP has walked this road before, and you know, and you were good, I think, in identifying some of those potential problems and solutions, and that's been, hopefully we'll take that more into account as we move along. And then obviously Natalie Forsyk and Karima Frayabi, important to see that other countries are moving along and seriously considering implementing the index. So we come to the end of the session. I'd like to thank my colleagues in this cost secretariat for all their good work, and not only in putting this webinar together, but also in all the preparatory work and all the work that you do on a day-to-day basis in spreading the gospel of greater infrastructure transparency. So thank you all. Have a very good day. Stay safe. And I'm sure we'll meet again at some point in time. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.